Hello everyone, welcome. Welcome to this National Retrofit Hub webinar on our Archetypes Library and Best Practice Guide. We'll just give it a minute or so for everyone to join the meeting before we kick off. Great, so hope you're all doing really well. Yeah, as I mentioned, this is the National Retrofit Hub webinar on our Archetypes Library and Best Practice Guide. This is a resource that we created through extensive engagement with our working group members, and it was supported by Westminster City Council. I'm going to give an introduction to the resources, and then we're going to hear from two fantastic speakers. We're joined by Lauren Shevels, who's Lead Retrofit Innovation and Delivery Officer at Westminster City Council. She's leading the borough's Retrofit Task Force. She's a trained architect and environmental activist with a real passion for community-driven projects, and she's also co-founder of the Architects Climate Action Network, which is where I was very pleased to meet Lauren and start on my own journey into sustainable design. We're also joined by Naomi. Naomi is a Passive House certifier and energy model with 20 years experience in sustainable construction, and she's been working with Etude for the last decade. She splits her time between Passive House certification and working on retrofit strategy projects, and she's input into lots of the Etude strategic retrofit work, primarily on modelling. We're going to have time for questions at the end, so please do start putting them in the chat and we'll get to them. And yeah, I'm going to kick off by sharing my screen and giving you a bit of an introduction to the guide itself. So I'm sure many of you know who the National Retrofit Hub are and are probably already joining our meetings and collaborating, but those of you that are new to us, welcome. We're a non-profit collaborative organisation that's been set up to enable the local delivery of retrofit at scale. We really want to do this through collaboration. So we know that there are so many different stakeholder groups involved in retrofit. It's completely cross-sectoral, and we want to enable collaboration between all of those different people and organisations. We want to empower them to work together, to share knowledge, to be more than the sum of their parts. And part of our role is to facilitate really good collective governance, leadership, and also start to try and form consensus within these groups, which is no mean feat. We have a series of different working groups throughout the hub. You can see more about these on our website, and they're all open to people who want to join them. So if you think that you've got a particular area of expertise or interest in any of these topics, then please do fill in the form and join us. This resource has been driven by Working Group 1. That's co-chaired by Dr. Asan Khan and Lizzie Westmacott, and also has had technical leadership from Toby Cambray and Louis Dalencourt. That group's really looking at what do we need to do to our buildings, but fundamentally, how do we make those decisions at scale? What data do we need? What tools and design guidance are available? And how do we make sure that the decisions that we make are both scalable and also ensuring quality? We see our role as really trying to bring forth the meaningful benefits that come from retrofit. So we talk about reducing emissions all the time, obviously reducing energy bills, but also see the benefits of retrofit to be far broader than that. So thinking about reducing grid load, improving energy security, but also creating comfortable, healthy homes, innovation, growth, and new jobs. And this guide really thinks about how we want to plan retrofit and design retrofit in a way that encompasses all of these different outcomes. To give you a bit of context as to the why of why we might take an archetypal approach, we thought it would be useful to include some stats from a different resource we published. A few months ago, we published our Retrofit State of the Nation report, which looked at how many retrofits are currently being done and how many properties still need to be retrofit and the scale and pace of increase that we need. So we know that there are over 14 million households in the UK that are below an EPC-C. If we set that as the standard, which I think many on this call would probably agree isn't quite high enough, we've still got a long way to go. In fact, if you look at England alone, there are nearly 12 million homes below EPC-C. That's the green bubble. There have been just over 2 million retrofit measures delivered since 2013, and quite a lot of those were just boiler replacements. So the extent of work that's already being done is in white. And of those, we still don't know that they are meeting our net zero health and wellbeing needs. And all of that means that we need to dramatically scale up the pace of retrofit across the UK. If we did that in a linear fashion, we would need to increase it by sixfold. So we know we need to think about different ways of doing this work that go beyond the one by one, project by project, individual home by individual home approach. We think some key solutions include providing better access to data and information on homes, so we know that the decisions we make will have the right impact. We think that improving project pipeline certainty for supply chain and skills would also help enable investment and growth if we're aware of the retrofit projects that could potentially be out there. We think that there needs to be better methodologies to meet funding and finance requirements and streamlined abilities to bid for those local authorities, for example, who really struggle to resource the requirements that are required to even get the funding they need. We think project aggregation is really critical as well, so that we're creating efficiencies of scale, and also public engagement and information. Many homeowners and community groups want to know more about the buildings that they live in order to enable them to consider this work. So what we were talking about in our working group one for must be over a year now was the concept of archetyping. Archetypes are groups of buildings that share similar features and are likely to require similar interventions to make them low energy and low carbon, climate resilient and healthy. So why might you archetype? It gives you a really quick understanding of a building stock, and it's an accessible start to planning retrofit projects. It helps you to do project aggregation so that you can identify similar buildings that might have similar retrofit plans. And also it could enable collaboration between people who might have shared ownerships within their portfolios, if there's some research to be done on a specific type, for example. They also can be used for householder engagement by providing more information on a home beyond the recommendations that are currently included in the EPC. And they could be used to inform supply chain forecasting. If we know how many of what type of building and what plans are required for those buildings, then we could be able to take that data to understand what we need in the supply chain. They also have the potential for storing knowledge on known risks. So if we know that a specific type of building has certain common risks associated with it, both in its current condition and in risks associated with poorly done retrofit work, we could start to build up that data to allow us to de-risk projects. We think that obviously the big data and stock modelling is really important for lots of people within retrofit, but not everyone has access to be able to interpret those large quantities of data. So this is a really sort of accessible way in to unveil patterns within stock model data without the user needing to be a data analyst themselves. And also, when we did a knowledge centre survey, we found that this was the #1 most wanted type of information that people wanted to see. So there's a real demand for people within the industry to see example retrofit plans for housing archetypes. But our working group was really cautious. They suggested that there are weaknesses with this approach. Every home is different. It's difficult to optimise the number of segments. Some people say that there might be 20 archetypes across the UK. Some people say there might be thousands. Different users need different things. So taking a blanket approach and promoting blanket solutions might not be appropriate. And also it might be difficult to incorporate changes to buildings that might on the surface appear to be the same archetype, but also that they might include things like extensions or repairs or maintenance or replace products. There are also risks associated. So if someone took an archetypal design guide and interpreted it as a complete solution and just gave it to their builder and said, do this, please, then there would be unintended consequences likely associated with that. They might overlook things like communal procurement, and they might also overlook condition and maintenance issues if not done correctly. Heritage value isn't always that easy to capture depending on the location of the specific building and its specific context. It might vary even within identified archetypes. There's a discussion around design liability, and also where poor quality data has been used, then the archetype itself might not be very good quality. But we think that there is enough within this approach, and people are already using an archetypal approach to say, yes, there are risks, yes, there are weaknesses, but let's put in place a strategy to overcome those and take those risks and make them into opportunities. We think that a good way of doing that would be to clearly define the use case of the archetype. There might be different reasons why you might create this guidance, and that's really important to identify, and I'll come on to that in a bit. You need to identify the scope, the level of detail, the known risks associated with the archetypes, be really clear on the outcomes that your archetype guide is targeting, and also make clear the links between suggested measures. And there's an opportunity here to future-proof these. So to make sure that this isn't an analog standalone PDF that just sits in a drawer, but also can provide some data and stock model interoperability, create connections with digital building logbooks, and start to inform thinking around EPCs and data access. So there are loads of great examples already out there on archetyping. Achieved Raft and Parity did the Retrofit London Housing Action Plan, where they categorized London into 8 different archetypes. This was quite high level to begin with, but was really useful because it started to show what categories dominate in which boroughs and where there might already be opportunities for boroughs to collaborate with one another to tackle. For example, you can see that quite a lot of them here have solid brick mansion blocks. So there's an opportunity already there to say, okay, can Westminster, Kensington and Camden work together to design something around these? FCBS Studio produced a guide for Devon. This was a slightly different use case in that it was targeted at both householders and local builders to inspire them on how you might start to retrofit some of the more specific local vernacular within Devon. They gave a really clear overview of retrofit, and they've also incorporated these really easy to follow pattern book details for each archetype. KCA, Additional Studios and XCO2 also produced a guide for social housing providers that is tackling the common social housing types that they've encountered. And they go into quite a lot of detail for each with sort of detailed design drawings, proposed measures, schematics, and estimated performance improvements for each. So this is really targeted at helping those people that are looking to procure work to know where to start. So we thought, okay, there's loads of great work going on in this space. What is the role of the National Retrofit Hub? And what we wanted to do is really set best practice for those producing archetypes, so we can start avoiding some of the risks that might happen because of using this approach, but also build on opportunities that are available. We also wanted to host a library of all of these documents because there's so much great work already out there. We wanted to make it really accessible. We wanted to collaborate and convene on data interoperability and also how these link to digital building logbooks. So what we've done is released 2 pieces of resource, the Archetypes Best Practice Guide, which I'm going to talk through now. This was supported by Westminster City Council and had feedback from across our working group 1 and wider stakeholders, and was produced through engagement with London councils as well. So lots of people coming in and really helping us define this. The guide itself takes you through a few key parts. It talks about how you might start to identify archetypes, and then it talks about what the contents of any archetypal guidance that you create should do. It's really aimed for both those producing archetype retrofit guides and also building owners who want to procure the retrofit guide itself. So to start with, we thought about identifying archetypes, and we identified that there are lots of different characteristics that you might use to identify an archetype, depending on the building stock that you're presented with and the use case. So we've set them out here so you can kind of pick and choose from these depending on what works for you. These different sort of buckets also overlay with the types of information that we can imagine going into a digital building logbook. So there's some crossover between this guide and the one that we produced on those logbooks as well. And you can imagine that an archetype might be able to feed into the logbook if that information is parallel. We then looked at use cases and thinking about the target audience and the purpose. And there's a couple of use cases within the guide, one of which is looking at a project that Etude specifically did, where they wanted to understand housing decarbonisation for a specific county council, which meant that they were easily able to understand what elements of the characteristics of the building could be used to produce an archetype. So there's some sort of starters here to allow you to get inspired to think, okay, I've got a certain use case, a certain client, a certain target audience, a certain scale of buildings, certain size of stock that I'm looking at. How do I start to identify which of these characteristics will be useful for my specific use? So there's some ideas in the guide about how to do that. Then we talk about the contents of the guidance, and what we want to try and do is create a framework that people can be creative within, but make sure that the guidance that everyone's producing is really good quality and able to be compared with one another. There's 3 sections of information that we think should be included. The building information, so what is the archetype? The target outcomes that this guidance that you're producing is going for, and also the suggested measures that could be developed into an individual building retrofit plan by either yourselves or another user. So in terms of the building information, we've set out a list of what should be included. So things like photographs of the typology, explanation of how that typology deals with ventilation and moisture, likely areas requiring maintenance and repair, likely risks inherent with retrofit in the archetype, etc. And there's also some coulds that you could include if you want to go a bit further, depending on your use case. In terms of the outcomes, we know that there are lots of outcomes that you might be looking to achieve, depending on if there's a specific funding structure you're looking to fit within, or if there's specific client demands or client needs. So we've set out a list of outcomes that you might consider, but also thought about how you might package the retrofit measures. So maybe you might want to do a package which is about reducing disruption to tenants. Maybe you might want to do one that's about cost effectiveness. It all depends on your use case, but this gives you some ideas of what you should be considering. And then the suggested measures. So we're saying that each of the packages of retrofit measures should include fabric upgrades, ventilation services, and renewables, and a consideration for each and whether or not they're appropriate for your archetype selected and how they might be appropriate. And then we've given some guidance on what should be included when you're setting out those packages of measures, including estimates for your energy demand reduction associated with the packages, peak heat load reduction, and carbon emissions. And we'd really like people to think about including embodied carbon there as well. There's a long list of also what you could include depending on your use case. So, for example, you might be thinking about heat pump readiness if that's a specific target within your project. The second piece of this resource is the library. So on our website, you can see all of the different publicly available archetype guides that are already out there. These are categorized by the archetypes included within the guide and the region. If you've got guides yourself that you want to be included, please do send us an email and we'll get them up there as well. We want to include as many as we possibly can. So that's it for an overview of the guide itself. I'm now going to hand over to Lauren, who's going to talk a little bit about Westminster's strategy here and how this might apply to them. So over to you, Lauren.
Thanks. I'm just pulling up my slides. Hopefully you should be able to see the cover.
Yep, that's perfect.
Brilliant. Okay, yeah. Thank you so much for inviting us along. As Rachel's already said, we're absolutely delighted to be a supporter of the Archetype Best Practice Guide. I'm going to talk to you about what that means from a local authority perspective. Hopefully there are some other local authority officers on the call. I've seen maybe a couple. But yeah, I'm really here to talk about how we plan to implement this guidance across our own archetypes. Before I do that, I'm going to take you through the task force, which I lead and manage at Westminster Council. So what is a retrofit task force and who's on it? We established the Westminster Retrofit Task Force back in 2022, where we developed an early delivery plan with complementary work streams, which was aimed at addressing the identified barriers and upscaling delivery of retrofit at a systemic level. And I was really pleased that Rachel presented that kind of 6-fold step change, because we're really hyper aware that if we don't change our approach from incremental kind of pilot projects to an actual kind of paradigm shift in how we're delivering retrofit, we're not going to reach our net zero targets. So who and what is the task force and who's on it? So the Retrofit Task Force is an predominantly internal team at Westminster City Council and is comprised of council officers and external stakeholders. We're lucky enough to have 3 independent industry experts, Sarah Edmonds, who is the co-director of the National Retrofit Hub, Alex Whitcroft and Nicholas Heath. We also work closely with Historic England, given that we have such a high historic building stock in Westminster. And we work kind of cross-collaboratively across the council. We're actually situated within the town planning team, so I sit within the design, conservation and sustainability team. So not directly involved with our housing or corporate property asset managers who are more on the delivery side of retrofit. So what does that look like in terms of our actual buildings? So 86% of Westminster's emissions are produced from energy used in our homes, offices and other buildings. These buildings include 11,000 listed buildings in 56 conservation areas, which cover almost 80% of the borough. So that's a really high number of heritage built environment there. So the council declared a climate emergency in 2019 and subsequently brought out its climate action plan in the same year. Under 5 key themes, the council targets to be a net zero council by 2030, but we're targeting for the city of Westminster to be net zero by 2040. So that includes all the buildings that we don't own. Our work within the task force predominantly falls under the efficient buildings theme. So what does that 86% look like in terms of a breakdown? So we have both non-domestic and domestic portfolio stock. A lot of it, as I mentioned, is not ours. So buildings that we have soft influence over, for example. We have 15% of those emissions of that total 86 come from residential, and then 71% come from institutional, industrial and commercial buildings. So the non-domestic portfolio of our building stock. And it's really important to mention that the council will not be able to achieve its net zero targets without a consolidated borough-wide approach, which is really why we welcome this kind of strategic visioning from the National Retrofit Hub. In terms of our archetypes and how that looks across the geographical spread of Westminster, so as I mentioned, we have 56 conservation areas, which have been designated by the council for their special architectural and historic interest. That covers about 80%. Conservation areas in the south are generally dominated by government and institutional buildings, so that's Whitehall, etc. Whereas we have commercial and mixed-use buildings, which are prevalent in areas such as Soho and Marylebone. And their historic layout and dense built environment contribute to distinct local character, but they also contribute to a complex built environment, which is hard to decarbonise. So historic buildings are often slightly harder, I think, to archetype. We can have a solutions approach to that, but maybe that's something we can talk about in the Q&A. These are just 3 of our kind of varied conservation areas. We've got the Whitehall conservation area, Strand conservation area, and then the Westbourne conservation area, which is more residential. As I mentioned, we have 11,000 listed buildings, and that's approximately broken down into 5% being grade 1 listed, 10% being grade 2 star listed, and the remaining 85% being grade 2 listed. And again, that's really hard to archetype. So whilst we're promoting an archetype approach, we have to accept in Westminster that actually a lot of our buildings don't fall into those kind of categories, but there will be some kind of clear wins, I think, that we can establish. And then within the context of our own housing stock, so Westminster City Council manages approximately 12,000 homes, of which 2,300 are either listed or in a conservation area. And the vast majority of these are in blocks of flats, which often have complex ownership models and tenures. They're often pepper-potted with leaseholder, which make them harder to retrofit. And I think Rachel already mentioned that in her intro, that there are kind of ownership archetypes as well as kind of architectural archetypes. And this is what some of our own building stock looks like. So we've got the Millbank estate, which is grade 2 listed, the Queen's Park Conservation Area, which is low-rise workers' cottages, and then Lillington and Longmoor in Pimlico, which is post-war social housing. And we're quite unique, I guess, as being a central London borough, that the City of Westminster has many large landowners. Some of the most prevalent of those landowners are known as the Great Estates and feature on our city plan. So we've got people like the Church Commissioners, Crown Estate, Great Portland Estate, Grosvenor Estate, Howard de Walden, and the Portman. And whilst it's worth saying that there will generally be lots of different archetypes across those estates, not one portfolio is the same, generally speaking. So the challenges and barriers, I think we're all well aware of these, but policy and regulation around historic building stock is a big one for us, and the perception around retrofit policy and practice, which is not well understood, with planning being perceived as more of a barrier than it actually is. And then breaking that down into our domestic, we've got 86% of our homes are in mansion blocks or converted street properties. So again, Rachel showed that retrofit housing action plan from London councils, which Etude were a co-author of. And in that kind of top bracket, there's a lot of solid brick archetype construction there, most of which for us is in flats. And then the non-domestic, so this is also complex because we've got to engage with different commercial property owners. As I mentioned, 71% of the borough's carbon emissions are coming from that group of buildings. And this is even more challenging because of our 56 registered businesses, 80% are SMEs. So retrofit is not often at the top of their agenda. So the task force actually operates under 5 key work streams, and these were established from that inaugural workshop that I showed a picture of back in October 22. The first is indeed an archetype approach and retrofit procurement club. And this looks at exploring a procurement club as a means to deliver quality retrofit for a variety of stock owners. The second is planning policy and process, which supports the development of retrofit planning policy and exploring the opportunities that exist within the existing planning system. The third is a partnership pilot projects and case studies. So looking at developing pilot projects with partner organisations and having, kind of soft influence over stock owners in the borough as a way to demonstrate pathways to good retrofit. Number 4 is a neutral and collaborative stewardship model, so supporting stewardship vehicles to complement existing work in the field of retrofit, which is why we were so keen to support this archetype best practice guide that the National Retrofit Hub produced, and communications guidance and training, so contributing to the improved communication around retrofit and providing adequate guidance and training both internally for decision makers at the council, but also externally for stock owners within the borough. So as I mentioned, the work of the task force is grounded in an archetype approach, and as such, we're really delighted to support the Hub's best practice guide. The framework is valuable as a resource to anyone trying to scale retrofit delivery by helping to standardise the approach to archetyping. We believe that it offers a means to accelerate retrofit delivery through the aggregation of building types, an approach which is crucial for any local authority. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about how we plan to use that. So archetyping is a well-used and powerful tool to try and understand and profile building types. Our overall aim at the task force is to make retrofit simpler by using archetypes. And the task force is doing this through understanding our own building stock, profiling groups and aggregating demand, but also separating archetypes depending on use case, and target audience. We wanted to support this guidance not only because it's an important contribution to the sector, but also because we plan to implement it on our own building stock. So what does an archetype approach mean to WCC, Westminster City Council? Most recently, we've been looking at defining an archetype approach, so an off-the-shelf solution for building types, giving projects a kickstart and reducing repetition of work across the sector, and looking at how that feeds into those other work streams. So using a retrofit procurement club as a compliant way of procuring retrofit services and works, simply and more reliably for stock owners and groups of homeowners. So the opportunity to aggregate demand based on archetypes, but also using it as a tool to inform our work in the planning innovation work stream. So looking at policy reform and pre-approvals and generally making it clearer and simpler to streamline retrofit delivery through planning. I'm just going to show you this very quickly because in Workstream 1, I've also talked about a retrofit procurement club. And that would be established kind of through 4 key phases of collaboration, design, planning, and procurement. But really crucially, under the design section of that, we're looking at an archetype approach. So I think what I'm getting at here is that an archetype approach for Westminster City Council is really foundational in how we approach this. I'm just going to whiz through this because I'm a bit conscious of time, but we're looking at different forms of planning innovation. So a lot of that is to do with listed building consent, but also through planning consent. So seeing how we might give blanket planning consent to different types of development, which again feeds back to an archetype approach. So given the number of listed buildings, we've started looking at that comparatively to our own housing stock. So this is an overlay of our estates of listed buildings. But then again, looking at how we might work with the bigger landowners in Westminster through an archetype approach. And just one live project that we've got on at the moment is the task force is seeking to establish a local development order in the Queen's Park estate, and this is out for public consultation at the moment. But as I mentioned, the Queen's Park estate has those kind of low-rise worker cottages. So we've been looking at granting blanket planning consent for window upgrades here from single glazing to heritage compliant double glazing. And we wouldn't be able to take that approach without a kind of an archetype methodology. And that's just to say that's the commonplace page. So yeah, that's me. Happy to take questions in the chat, but you're very welcome to drop me an email on this email address.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was really great context for all of this work. And yeah, really exciting to hear about the plans for the Westminster Retrofit Task Force. I'm going to hand over now to Naomi. So yeah, over to you, Naomi. Please do keep putting your questions in the chat as well. I can see lots coming in already. So yeah, please keep adding. And yeah, thanks, Naomi. Over to you.
Thanks. Can we share? Is that working?
That looks great. Yes.
Great. Yeah, thanks for inviting us. I'm really happy to be here. And so we've been asked to share our study on the Cornwall housing decarbonisation strategy, which is sort of a slightly different take on how we normally approach archetypes. This time we looked at archetyping led by heat pump readiness. So a lot of the focus was on working out which buildings you could put a heat pump in earlier rather than later, and then using that to kind of prioritise the decarbonisation process. So these are my colleagues, Kate and Chris, who I did the work with. So a bit of background into Etude's archetyping journeys. So Rachel mentioned earlier the Retrofit London Housing Action Plan, which is our first main piece of work on archetypes, which was sort of setting a framework for local authorities and to follow for which gave guidance on how to work with archetypes. And then the local authorities then working in more depth. And then the other pieces of work we've done are examples of working with local authorities and other organisations to use archetypes to help sort of simplify the retrofit challenge and create packages of work that could perhaps be extrapolated and then adapted for specific buildings. The one in the middle is an example from ESSA, which is London Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. That's been recently released and is publicly available, and it's a good one to look if you want to kind of get an idea of potential for retrofit in conservation areas as well. And so going on from this, Cornwall is the example in the bottom left. On the bottom right is a different local authority on the south coast, which are also interested in this idea of heat pump ready led approach. So we've kind of taken this idea on forward into different work. So I wasn't going to show this, but because I think it's in the audience, but we can't really talk about archetypes without speaking about Thomas. I'll skip by that pretty quickly though, because he'd be embarrassed. I think he might actually be in the audience. But yeah, he's been working in most of those projects and got a lot of the rest of us enthusiastic about archetypes. So heat pumps, this is kind of why we ended up, we identified there's an urgency that we need to decarbonise heating quickly. And in Cornwall, there's a particular opportunity for heat pumps because the climate is milder, and there's been a higher uptake in the past. So the reasons are on the left, there's the carbon emission factor comparison per unit of heat energy delivered. So compared to a gas boiler, heat pumps are at least like 4 times as efficient, and they're carbon wise, and then cost wise, if when we look at optimizing the system and increasing the efficiency, the cost is really can be reduced quite significantly, especially using dynamic tariffs and solar PV. So that's a bit of background to why the heat pump focus in this study. Looking into the barriers and opportunities for heat pumps, we kind of started to identify that it wasn't all about fabric. There's we needed to consider the electricity supply capacity. So that's one of the things that needs to be checked early doors. And also there's a lot of scope for increasing the efficiency by increasing radiator sizes and pipe diameters. So it's not necessarily all about getting the fabric down to the right level. There's other parts of the puzzle that can be tackled at the appropriate time as well. And just to be clear, we're not saying don't touch the fabric ever. We're just saying that in some cases, or in a lot of cases, the heat pump can go in first and probably should go in first alongside the easy wins and high impact measures. And it can be more appropriate to tackle the more difficult fabric measures further on the line when the alongside maintenance that's required anyway. So it was an interesting process for us because within the project team we agreed that okay, some buildings are heat pump ready. So the graph on the right is the left, sorry, is saying these are easy to install, very quick, and the one on the right is these are big old properties. It's going to be a lot more difficult. There's some enabling works needed first, some heavy fabric measures, and then there's some sort of cases in between. And the thing we couldn't agree on was how many of these, where's the line, where do you get to? And I think my starting point was, well, a lot of them are going to need a lot of work. And we had a lot of debate around where this line could be, and we've did some site visits and general exploration of housing types around Cornwall, and we looked at this distribution of age and size. So basically, if a building is very small, then it's going to have a low absolute heating capacity, and easy to install a heat pump earlier. And if it's bigger, it's more difficult, and if it's older, it's more difficult because the fabric condition's worse. So I'll go on briefly to explain how we kind of got to the shape of this. Incidentally, my house with a broken boiler is right on the edge, so I had a particular interest in this, particularly recently. I won't dwell on this too long, but just as a bit of background, we looked at heating engineer assumptions for space heating demands for different ages of buildings and different sizes of buildings. And the only thing you really need to know is that the red area is the bit we thought would be very difficult, and the red area kind of shrunk as we did some more analysis. And the area we focused on, so this basically shows the same thing, but the other way around. So this is floor area, and then the ages go from oldest to at the bottom, and then the newest at the top. And the numbers are from EPC data that we had access to. So it's covering about 2/3 of the stock, but we think that proportionally it's representative of Cornwall stock. So there's a lot of small buildings. So this is 40 to 70 square meters, and this is 70 to 100 square meters. So this is the bit we sort of chose to examine in more detail, because we weren't sure whether they would be heat pump ready immediately. So we did 2 models in PHPP, which is Passive House Planning Package. The method we used was basically, instead of just taking one example of one building for each archetype, we took a range of assumptions for each building, which could cover different fabric conditions, different orientations and shading factors, and air change rates. So we had a kind of very good version of a home to a very poor version of a home, and it could represent quite a lot of different ages of building. So this was our sort of slight departure to the way we normally do archetypes. Our archetypes would normally have been slightly more constrained. And within that, we chose random values within a uniform distribution, which I won't go into in too much detail, but basically there was sort of equal probability of getting a value from one end of the range to the other. And what that gave us is basically a distribution of results. So these are like probability, there's a frequency of lots for each. So there's a heating load along the bottom, and then the number of times that it came out with that result in that bin in the y-axis. So the 14 is the space heating load below which we thought a heat pump is likely to be ready more or less straight away. Sorry, a home could be heat pump ready straight away. So for small houses with cavity walls, basically it was all of the time. Same with small house with solid walls. This is 70 square meters. And when it got to larger homes, these were 100 square meters and a little bit more complicated. Cavity walls still okay. Solid walls is where it starts to get towards the edge, and we kind of got worked out there's likely that about 60% of the time they would be heat pump ready, and some of the rest would need a little bit of work. To show that in a slightly different way, so it's the same size kind of thing looking from above. So you've got the range across there and the more common values in the middle. So 95% would be in this dark grey area. So when we get to the larger house with solid walls, there's a bit of a spread that crosses the line of heat pump readiness. But if you change the lofts to all insulated and you reduce the air tightness to 5 air changes per hour, which is not overly ambitious, and take out the detached versions, because in the original analysis you got terrace, semi-terrace and detached. So they're all heat pump ready. So it's we were very surprised by this. And so this, in the little plot at the top, that's the bit we were looking at here. So the heat pump ready line was kind of creeping further and further over to the right. And the next job is basically to tackle the next bit of the tower and see which of the larger homes could also be heat pump ready. So just to assure you, we're not completely obsessed with heat pumps, and we haven't forgotten about fabric. So in this piece of work, there was like a step-by-step approach of the types of measures you might do for different types of homes. And then in the appendices, we went into more detail, and we drew on work by some of the wonderful people we've worked with, whose logos you can see on the right, and to make sure people still understood the importance of getting the junctions right, getting the planning right, and all that sort of thing. So yeah, it's not all about heat pumps, but for us in this project, a lot of it was. That's it. I think we'll take questions at the end, but yeah, do feel free to get in touch. We love chatting to people. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Naomi. I think we're all going to rejoin you on the screen. We've had lots of questions come in. I might start with one that's directly related to your presentation, Naomi. A couple of people have been asking, that we've had Ewan Lockhead and Catherine ask about, did heat pump readiness consider whether heating costs would reduce post retrofit, and do any of the properties require secondary heating? So did that come into the study at all?
So we're basing it on heat pump readiness with a good COP. So if the COP is like more than 3.5, 4, and then there's potential to do other things like use dynamic tariff and look at emitter sizes. So I think generally we're assuming there's cost parity there. I think Chris Warboys might be on the call, and I'm sure he's got a lot more to say about this. If we,
I've seen
when
him
we
in
do.
the chat. So if you want to put anything in the chat, Chris, that would be really useful. Okay, great. I'm going to go on to sort of a few of the questions that we received at the start. So Adam Slater asks, is there any data set on the number of archetypes per geography? Now, I'll do my best to give an answer from our perspective, and Naomi, I don't know if you've got any thoughts as well, but what I would say based on the work that we have done is it depends on how you're archetyping. So as I mentioned at the start, there are potentially 20 archetypes, or there are potentially 1,000 archetypes, depending on what your specific use case is. So if you want to go into a lot of detail and be really, really specific about the local vernacular, or be really specific about something, there could be many more than if you're just trying to get a really high level overview. One of the guides in the library is by Energy Technologies Institute, and they took 40 archetypes spread across the whole of the UK and have said how many of each of those house types exist across the whole of the UK. But obviously you might disagree with the way that they have delineated those archetypes. But yeah, I don't know if that's a question you've ever been asked before, Naomi, in your work.
How to spread them geographically, or
as in how many different
how many
archetypes exist per geography?
So we it's always a question that comes up every time we look at archetypes on a project, like how many is appropriate, and it's normally quite specific to the client and the area, and normally the organization's already got an idea of what are the most prominent buildings and use types and what's the biggest issue for them. So we definitely kind of take that as a starting point, and also take what we've seen elsewhere as a starting point, but we try and make it quite specific to an area and the question that's being asked. Like for Cornwall, it was a lot about how soon can we get heat pump in, so that was a very different question to yeah, what do we do with all these balconies on these buildings? So it depends. So, and it's got to be digestible as well, I suppose. So if you want lots of details, then it's got to be a smaller number.
Lauren, I wanted to come on to you with a question that's just come into the chat from Benjamin Webster. He says, do you think that the archetypal approach has a greater benefit in working with publicly owned or local authority stock compared to privately owned properties? I think sort of talking about whether or not this is an appropriate tool to communicate with householders, or whether it needs to be more sort of focused at that larger, more professionalized building owner.
Yeah, I think the target audience is a really good question here. And I think Naomi and you alluded to this in your presentations, but for us, I guess I mentioned that we're in quite a unique position where we have a lot of larger landowners within central London, and that is how we want to target kind of the private sector, I guess, and work collaboratively with them. So I think in understanding their archetypes, there might be scope for them to do a big chunk of this work. And then hopefully what would happen is that there would be kind of a trickle down approach where larger portfolio owners are actually doing the lion's share of work on their own portfolio or their own building stock, which could then be shared to the smaller not necessarily homeowners, but private non-domestic market as well, so that dissemination of knowledge and insights is shared beyond just what they're doing themselves. And I know that a lot of our large landowners are really open to this kind of approach of shared learnings, but I think we're all at the start of this archetype journey, really, and they'll be doing assessments which we hope could be shared with other stock owners in Westminster. And there's definitely coming at that kind of from the opposite end of the spectrum as well, like how do we work with our private domestic market are able to pay, because there are a lot of motivated residents in Westminster who want to have healthy homes, who want to have better insulated homes, that don't want to be spending a fortune on their fuel bills this Christmas. But without kind of a strategy and approach, it's very piecemeal. And I think that is part of the bigger question. And again, it feeds into that strategic ambition that the hub is setting, certainly.
And I think it sort of points towards something else that's been raised in the chat. So in response to what you've just been saying there, James, in the chat has said, if aggregation is one of the key benefits, then it does make sense that we're talking about the great estates, the large property owners, because they have the ability they're the ones that can decide to do this at an aggregate level. But I think there's also been a lot of good conversation in the chat about the role that community organisations can play in helping to create aggregated projects that might be owned individually. And I know we had a question from Rona that lots of people have been responding to on, are there any good examples of community energy initiatives looking at supporting and promoting retrofit? There's already some great recommendations in the chat, but I'd just like to signpost to one of the documents or one of the tools in the library is by Green Meadows, and they've created an archetypal guide which is specifically aimed at local householders so that they can understand what's needed for their home. So that's a really great guide to understand how community groups are using these and producing something that's quite a bit more accessible for the people that they're speaking to. There's a question here that's specifically related to the resource. CL asks, if the NIH guide to archetypes says what good looks like, will we only publish guides that conform to the recommendations? And is there a danger of proliferation of guides that will confuse users? So I would say, firstly, all the guides that are up there have been produced before our recommendations came out. They're generally guides that we've received from people who do good work in the space. The target audience for this resource are professionals working within the retrofit sector and beyond. The target audience for our resources at the moment is not sort of members of the public. So what we're saying to people is definitely do use your own judgment when you are accessing these guides. We haven't peer reviewed them, and we think that it's important that you make sure that, you know, these guides don't replace the need for more building specific retrofit plans, but they're a good step along the journey. And we will continue to add guides that we think are coming from reputable sources that don't necessarily comply with every single point of our recommendations, just because we're not in the position to be peer reviewing all of them. So hopefully that gives you some good context about how they should be used. Question, I guess, for you, Naomi, or sort of comment that I wondered if you wanted to respond to. So James Gingle from Desnes has said across England, their figures indicate that 90% of homes have a heat loss of less than 100 watts per metre squared, which indicates that they might be already heat tight enough to run low temperature heat pumps. Is that sort of similar to the findings that you are getting in the studies that you're doing? Obviously, I know you haven't done a study across the whole of the UK, but does that sort of ring true for you as well?
Yeah, I think 70, 80, 90%, those sorts of numbers were coming out. It depends a lot on the assumptions. That was the Cornish climate, which is a bit warmer, but it's yeah, not hugely surprising, because I think we haven't studied the larger buildings in a lot of detail, and I think we were surprised by how many were heat pump ready in the small to mediums. So I wouldn't be surprised if the proportion goes up.
That's really useful. I'm just having a look at what else we should come to. There's a question here around skills. So Aisha has said, are there enough retrofit consultants to deliver the retrofits? And is there a plan to collaborate with consultants to extend their expertise to be able to offer these services? So I guess it'd be interesting to come to you, Lauren, in terms of your experience in Westminster on skills. But from our perspective, one of our working groups is looking specifically at workforce growth and skills, and have been doing a lot of work to map how we can bring more people into the industry, and also acknowledging the fact that there's space for so many different types of roles within the retrofit world. Yes, you're right, there aren't enough people in this space at the moment. So we're sort of actively looking at how we can be part of scaling that up. But I don't know if you've had any sort of learnings in Westminster on, even internally in the local authority, on retrofit skills and how you're trying to disseminate some of your knowledge as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a key part of this, and we haven't really touched on this yet, but I guess for a local authority, it's kind of a more manageable scale rather than discussing kind of the national picture. So we work closely with our economy team at Westminster City Council and our Ways department, so that's our adult learning services. But not only have we obviously identified that there's a green skills gap, there's also a green heritage skills gap for us, which is really pertinent to our building stock. So I think Historic England did a kind of analysis a few years ago about what that meant for the industry and what that meant for London specifically in terms of our heritage built environment. And Central London Forward were also looking at something around the green heritage skills gap as well. But I guess on a smaller level, it's mostly about being able to identify that it's there and target an approach to do that. So the benefit of being in a local authority is that we can do this in a really targeted local way, which means working with local colleges to ensure that the programming is right. And we've done a lot of peer reviews of their content and also being able to speak to experts that we have in the council to make sure that that the content and knowledge is there for colleges and working with heads of services. So yeah, as Rachel says, absolutely we need to address it and accept that there is going to be a skills gap, but how do we target that and make sure that there is a step change in kind of amounts of people ready to enter that market? And again, that's also a benefit of looking at things like the supply chain and a retrofit procurement club, because you can start aligning all of the different actors within the one-stop shop, so to speak.
I think as you've touched on heritage as well, it would be good to come on to a question from Oliver Wilson, which is talking about heritage and conservation areas and whether local authorities are becoming, in your view, more amenable when it comes to retrofitting listed properties. And does I suppose the bit that I would add is, do you think an archetypal approach could help support more consistent decision making on retrofit across local authorities?
Yeah, absolutely. There's huge potential for consistency. And I think from kind of feedback and engagement that we've done with applicants through our planning process, it's a lack of consistency that really frustrates them on conservation area decisions, but also grade 1 and grade 2 listed buildings where, you know, applicants are finding it frustrating where advice has differed in the past. So I think absolutely an archetype approach could be one solution to that. And I don't think we'd bring any sort of archetype guidance out without considering the implications to heritage and the decision making that comes from our planning officers. So the task force is very fortunate that we sit within town planning, but I'm not actually a planning officer. As Rachel mentioned in the intro, I'm an architect by background, and we're looking at more of kind of a strategic delivery plan, I guess, to ensure that step change. And part of that is going to be working with our planning officers. So absolutely, I think there's scope there for big improvements. But again, it's mostly about consistency. And that will vary from borough to borough as well. So perhaps having some sort of standardization for consistency in planning decisions for heritage stock across a city, for example, would be helpful, because it can be really overwhelming to applicants having heard different things from different boroughs. So that's also worth bearing in mind, I think.
Thanks so much, Lauren. I think we'll end on a technical question that's been getting a lot of engagement in the chat, which is around perceptions on breathability. So Dorota says a significant amount of householders that they come across don't want to insulate as they're afraid of losing breathability of their walls and floors. How are we addressing, or how should guides address moisture and air tightness? Often homeowners prefer to do nothing because they're worried about making poor decisions, particularly with sort of pre-1940s buildings. So I suppose from our perspective, we're expecting guys that people to produce to always focus on, always consider moisture, ventilation and air tightness. But I don't know, Naomi, in your work, if this is something that's come up quite a bit and how you think that this should be tackled on a sort of archetypal basis.
Yeah, I think, well, there's a lot in past 2035 that deals with moisture risk, and just to follow a kind of check the risks. They have a good risk matrix, so that then there's some general kind of rules of thumb about thicknesses of insulation if you're internally insulating a wall, what sort of materials to use, have the air tightness on the room side, to make sure the condensation isn't getting into sensitive areas in the wall. I'm trying to think of a good, I think past 2035 is a good place to start, but a lot of the retrofit guides that are publicly available sort of start to address this as well, like the ESSA guide that I mentioned earlier. I'll put it in the chat as well. just now.
Yeah,
But
I think you'll
I
find
think
that
there's a lot in there, and then that references other kind of useful documents. But it's understandable, but there are lots of ways to mitigate risk. So yeah, don't be too scared.
I think as well, like the idea of providing really good quality information about what the building is and how the building currently works and deals with moisture at the start, before you even go into the point of suggesting measures, is really important. So getting that and cementing that real understanding of how the building is currently working, and then for being aware of the changes that you're going to make and how that might influence that specific archetype. And we see this as a way of really being able to build that data so that we're all feeling more confident when we're dealing with these types of buildings. We have run out of time. There's loads of great conversation happening in the chat. I just want to say a massive thank you to Naomi and Lauren for joining us. Great presentations, and thank you so much for engaging in the Q&A afterwards. Thank you very much to everyone who's attended. We'll share the meeting recording and the slides with you all after this, and please do go check out the resource, download the guide, have a look at the library. And if you know of any guides we don't have in there that we should, just send us an email and we'll get them added. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone, and see you later.
Bye.